The opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not represent the views of any Grand Lodge nor a pendant body of Freemasonry.
Welcome back, brethren, to the Masonic Shelf, the podcast where we crack open the pages of Masonic literature and esoteric books. I am one of your hosts, Brad Kohanke.
And I am Chris Williams. And this month, our book of choice is Freemasonry's Hidden Brain Science by Michael Schiavello. And it's not the easiest of reads, but it has an amazing amount of information in it. And we wanted to start out this podcast by reading the back cover because there's a great amount of information there to start this thing off. And so what it says is this is Freemasonry in its ultimate expression, deeper and more vast than you could ever have imagined. Offering a revolutionary approach to the craft, Freemasonry's hidden brain science explains and proves the genius of Masonic ritual as a neurological, psychological, physiological, and metaphysical handbook for self-improvement and the attainment of higher consciousness. Best-selling author, television personality, and 32nd degree Freemason Michael Schiavello reveals startling discoveries made while plumbing the depths of Masonic ritual and symbolism. Discover how King Solomon's temple correlates specifically to the makeup and measurements of the brain of the human nervous system and unlock the true meaning of the Masonic pillars. Hiram Abiff, the Three Ruffians, the Legend of the Third Degree, Euclid's 47th Proposition, the Tyler Sword, and Caution, the Past Master's Jewel, the Obligation to Not Make Women Freemasons, and more. Unfolding like a self-help treasure map, Freemasonry's Hidden Brain Science reveals hidden meanings found within Freemasonry's allegories and symbolism, which go far beyond their literal interpretations and will change the way you think, act, and feel.
I mean, the basic premise is he explores how Freemasonry aligns with modern neuroscience, psychology, and human behavior. He claims that Freemasonry is a scientifically sound system for rewiring the brain toward virtue, self-improvement, and enlightenment. And I think he's right. I think that the ultimate goal of the book is to prove that that is actually the case. And some of the methods that he uses to go about proving that, I'm not so sure about. But we'll get into that. One of the first things he says is King Solomon's temple isn't an actual building, it's you. And every piece of the temple, as described in the Masonic lectures, is a representation of you. And I think it took a while for me to get to the point where I actually believed that in my Masonic journey, but I have believed it for a couple of decades now. I think that's a very accurate statement. So
there's a wealth of information here, and while I agree with you that some of his premises, some of the things that he touches upon are not as easy to prove, but by the same token, they're not as easy to disprove either. I mean, there was a surprise in every chapter. You know, one of the ones that kind of blew me away was the story about the three ruffians trying to gain passage into Ethiopia, and things just kind of came together when I read the story, when I read his interpretation of the story. and it's like, you know, they're trying to get away and get into Ethiopia to escape the fellow crafts that are following them, trying to catch them. But then the whole allegory changes a little bit when you think about uh, the ancient mysteries and what a candidate was subjected to in those ancient mystery schools. And one of them is that uh, any trip over water was interpreted as a raising of your consciousness. The author says that when the ruffians approach the seafaring man, he refuses their request to get on the boat and travel to Ethiopia, because he knows that they're not duly and truly prepared to gain this higher consciousness. They haven't taken control of their base uh, instincts, their base impulses and everything, and therefore he refuses them that opportunity for higher consciousness.
I mean, even the people that were going to see the oracle at Delphi had to symbolically cross the river Styx in order to get there. And you've even seen some shows on the History Channel where they think that they've found uh, representations of that in other locations where they were going to have their futures read or their questions answered or find out when it was going to be a good time to conduct a war or whatever. They had to go across water in order to get there. Um, so yeah, there is something to that. But again, it's like I said earlier. There's a lot of stuff in here that I thought was really interesting and impactful. But uh, some of the stuff I wasn't as comfortable with. But this whole idea about Freemasonry reshaping the mind through repetition, symbolism, and ritual, and guiding it towards virtuous thinking. I think there's a lot to that. I mean, how do the Masonic degrees function like structured therapy or meditative practice in
Yeah.
that respect? If you think about it, you go through the degrees one time as a candidate, but then you sit on the sidelines for everybody that comes after you. And if you're not sitting on the sidelines, then you're learning the work and you're the one that's repeating the work. So, and you and I've had this discussion before. When you learn the work in order to confer the work, you feel obligated to delve deeper into understanding what it is that you're communicating. So, yeah, by repetition, but also by conferring and then studying it and understanding it. Um, yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. And a large portion of this book is all about that. Neurons that fire together, wire together was one of the quotes that I remember. I thought that was really cool.
That was really cool. That was really cool. And something kind of came back from the backside of my memory when we were talking about it, as far as when he said it's all about the mind. Our ceremonies, our ritual and everything is all about the mind, completely. And then I remember an old brother a few years ago told me, don't remember how it came up, but he told me, he says, brother, it's about getting your mind right. And technically, he's saying the exact same thing. And how about all of the allegories in the Bible? I mean, a big part of this book was explaining or trying to explain a lot of the allegories in the Bible. And he made the comment that when we're told to look therein, alluding to the Bible, to learn the way to eternal life, that it's telling us to learn those allegories and how they affect our thinking going forward.
Yeah, he makes a couple of statements about the stories in the Bible being all allegories. And Yeah, to a certain extent, I think he's probably accurate, but I think that a lot of those stories are based on historical fact. And whether it's an allegory or a historical fact, it's still a story that teaches a lesson, right? So to go back and reread some of those stories, it it doesn't really matter whether it's an allegory or a true story. What matters is what you get from it, what you learn from it. And I think that's the whole idea behind most religious writings.
I agree.
You made a mention that a friend of yours had said it's all about getting your mind right. It's also about keeping your mind right because he does expand on the idea that your brain functions like a muscle, and the more you use it, the healthier it stays.
Let
And
me
you and I
say,
had
if
this
you
discussion
alert,
before about some of the older Masons that we know. I mean, we're older Masons now, but 20 years ago when we were talking about this, we weren't as old as we are now. And we would marvel at the fact that these 80 and 90-year-old guys could still remember and confer the degrees accurately. And we're still instructing people. I mean, my instructor back in 1991 was Charlie Holt. He was 90 years old. And boy, he was a great teacher. So this idea of memorizing the ritual, conferring degrees, knowing the floor work, and understanding what it means and practicing it over and over and over again, it keeps your mind sharp, you know? So I think there's a lot to be said for that.
I totally agree. And you hear stories all the time about, guys in nursing homes, that can barely recognize anybody and they're talking and not necessarily to anybody. And you get down close and listen and gosh, they're going over the work. And
Yeah.
that's,
Yeah.
it's amazing. And there's a quote in chapter 2 that I really, really liked, and I've heard it before, but I really like it. It's called, he says, inside of you is a master. He is the best of you, your higher consciousness. It is your job to find him and raise him. It is said that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And I tell you what, the minute I heard that, my question popped into my head. Is it possible that you are the teacher? You are your own teacher.
Right. You get to the point where you realize that it's not going to come from without, it's going to come from within.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Totally, completely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think that's a good allegory for my own Masonic experience because there certainly wasn't anything coming from without when I first joined.
Exactly. And that,
I had
that
to go
happened
off
a
and
lot.
learn it on my own.
Exactly. Exactly. And luckily for you, you took that route. You tried to find out all of that, to go and find out the information. How many brothers give up and they don't?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's part of the reason why we started to do this podcast is we wanted to get people to understand that yeah, there's like-minded brethren out there that they can seek out and commune with, discuss things with, bounce ideas off of, but also to get everybody reading again,
Exactly.
and make their own interpretations of some of this stuff that we're talking about. Um,
Exactly.
Freemasonry is very much about your brain. Beneath the surface, it tells us about how your brain works, how to align your brain with your body, and use both to raise your consciousness and ignite your divine spark. Try this on for size. We're told that the two pillars which stood at the entrance of King Solomon's temple, named Boaz and Jachin, measured 18 cubits high. The human spinal cord, which extends from the brain to the lumbar region, is 18 inches high. Each pillar was topped with the chapiters of 5 cubits each. The human brain is 5 inches wide. Boaz and Jachin were hollow pillars with a circumference of 12 cubits. The human spinal cord is hollow with a circumference of 12 millimeters. The chapiters, symbolic of the human brain, were decorated with lily work. Lily flowers open at the top like a trumpet. In Eastern religion, it is the open lotus flower that represents the awakened individual. The pillars, Boaz and Jachin, symbolize your end goal to be brought to light. It's all about awakening and illumination. I don't know that when the degrees were developed hundreds of years ago, prior to the Grand Lodge of England being formed in 1717, that they knew that the human spinal cord was 18 inches high, that the brain was 5 inches wide, and that the spinal cord was hollow with a circumference of 12 millimeters, and then built into the work, the measurements of the pillars. I don't know that I necessarily buy that. So trying to utilize these measurements in order to prove his point, I think kind of misses the mark for me. But that doesn't take away from the message of the book. It's just some of the things that he's using to try to prove his case don't fly with me, I guess, is a way of putting it. So let's get into this right brain, left brain stuff.
Okay, I've been waiting.
So, you and I have talked about this offline, about the left brain and right brain stuff, and how each hemisphere controls certain aspects of your personality, whether it be the creative, emotional side, or the logical reasoning side. And he makes great use of this throughout the book and really prefers one side over the other if you're going to aspire to attain higher consciousness. I like the premise of that because for me, it reminds me of the Lover's Tarot card, where, you've got this image of a divine being kind of overlooking a man and a woman. And the man is looking at the woman and the woman is looking at the divine being, which to me indicates that you're not going to get where you want to be solely through logic and reason. You have to include intuition, emotion, and all of that, what we would consider feminine aspects of a human being. You have to do both. So he's looking at her, she's looking at the divine. So I get what he's saying, but he's talking about it in a pre-2013 kind of way. You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, and like you said, we did talk about this. He used what is generally considered a debunked theory, right brain versus left brain, to make this analogy or make his case on this. For me personally, it doesn't matter to me personally because I get the idea that he's trying to present. One side is different from the other side. One, just like you just explained, one side controls this, the other side controls this, and we need to feed more off of this side than this side for certain things. And I get all that, and I enjoyed the read, and I didn't even know. I mean, everybody's heard about right brain, left brain, the theory, a lot of stuff, but I did not know it had been debunked. Which
No, I
shows
hadn't either until we started to research it a little bit.
Keeping up, and I was shocked.
I mean, there is truth to the fact that each hemisphere processes the world differently. What it sees and stuff. Yeah. But in order to, it's not that simple. It's not that, okay, well, right. If I'm going to process images of symbols and understand what it is that they mean, I'm only using the right side of my brain. It really utilizes both, and they interact with each other on virtually everything. Now, cognitively, it may be more prevalent on one side than the other, but
there's a whole lot more to it than we know about, and possibly that's why he used that, because it's pretty definitive when you use that type of thinking back and forth, whether it's real or not real. It really stands out as, I mean, it's easy to understand the reasoning there. And so I enjoyed it. I'll be honest with you, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the way he set it up and the way he made it work. And real or not, I hope someday maybe I'll meet him, and I guarantee you I'll ask him and get some ideas.
Yeah, and if you really think about it, Masonry, through the logic of its presentation and the symbols, kind of stimulates both hemispheres. So, I mean, there is some validity to what he's saying. It's just the way that he described it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mesh with current scientific thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, it stands to reason that a certain part of the brain would take the lead on certain things, and a certain part of the brain would take the lead on other certain things. So all that stuff's easy enough to understand. Whether it's scientifically perfectly accurate or not, I don't know.
Yeah. But at the very least, Freemasonry encourages the synthesis of the two in the way that it does its teaching, the way that the ritual is confirmed, and the symbols that are used specifically to convey some of the moral and lessons.
Oh my God!
It's all about balance, right? It's balance between the two.
It's about balance, and it's about equilibrium. And guess what? We just made another understanding of an allegory. It's peace and harmony.
Yeah, it's the middle pillar, right?
Right, the middle pillar, peace and harmony in the lodge. If the lodge is the brain or the brain is the lodge, then yeah, we just found some peace and harmony. So, golly, I feel good about this already.
So I'm going to go through some of these things that I highlighted in the book and get your feedback on it. And if you want, you can do the same with me. A mystic believes that there is a deeper state of existence beyond the daily grind of the material world. He relies on direct experience, not on indirect knowledge or theory, to attain union with ultimate reality.
I would go as far as to say that the mystic doesn't just believe. I believe the mystic knows that reality exists out there, and I think that's certainly a lot of the reason why mystics are doing what they're doing.
Yeah, it certainly makes it a lot easier for us to engage in this type of activity, knowing that there is a higher plane of reality
Exactly.
that we're trying to aspire to.
And you get to a certain point, and you stop wondering if there is that higher plane, and start knowing that there has to be that higher plane. And there's a difference in mind in that. There's a different frame of mind for that. I want to throw one back at you real quick. He says that Freemasonry, and this kind of goes right down your alley, but Freemasonry is the modern incarnation of the ancient mystery schools, which focused on the brain and mind as the means to free higher consciousness from the shackles of ego. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that quote, and well, it resonated with me because I'm big on the ancient mystery schools and its correlations to modern day Freemasonry. He thinks that they understood the impact that this type of stuff has on behavior, on thinking, on virtuous living, on how we conduct ourselves on a daily basis. And I think that is 100% true. I think it's 100% accurate. But when he gets to the point where he tries to prove that these ancient mystery schools understood the inner workings of the brain and geared their teachings to affect certain parts of the brain because they knew how that part, what that part dealt with, how it impulse control or whatever. I don't think that is necessarily true from a scientific perspective. I think it was more an observational thing where they saw the result of different ways of imposing these things on people, and over a period of time and through trial and error, they weeded out what didn't work and kept what did and added to it. Um, I don't. I think the end result is the same, um, but I don't think that there was this intention to scientifically impact certain parts of the brain. I think that the intention was to affect behavior, and through observation, they saw what worked and what didn't work. So
Yeah, and truly, there had to be. You have to uh, believe that they took a little bit of liberality with their findings at times. You know, they may not have had the definitive answer they were looking for, but they had the idea of where they wanted to go with it, and they went there. You know, so
Mhm.
you got to give them, give them that possibility too.
He's got a lot of really good quotes from a lot of really esteemed Masons and scientists throughout the book, which are really, really good. And one of them is in defense of his approach to Masonry as a science. He quotes Albert Mackey. And Mackey says, Freemasons are now expected to be more learned than formerly in all that relates to the science of the order. Its origin, its history, its objects are now considered worthy of the attentive consideration of its disciples. The rational explanation of its ceremonies and symbols and their connection with ancient systems of religion and philosophy are now considered as necessary topics of inquiry for all who desire to distinguish themselves as proficient in Masonic science. So, Masonry, I mean, Mackey believes Masonry is a science. And if you recall, um, in our monitor in Texas, it's referred to as a science. So,
Absolutely.
just because you repeated some words, had a blindfold removed, and strapped a piece of lambskin around your waist does not make you a Mason. True Freemasonry is not that easy. It requires some actual work and dedication on your part before you will ever realize what the ritual calls light. Everything in Freemasonry, every step, every sign, every working tool, every symbol, and every word has a rich symbolic meaning designed to help us understand our spiritual/internal life and contribute towards achieving a shift in consciousness, a connection to our higher self. I wish I had written that,
Oh yeah,
because that is beautifully said and
yeah.
certainly correlates with what you and I believe. One of them was about the square versus the compass and what it means as the positioning of the two instruments during the progression of the degrees means. Um, he says in the symbolism of the square and compasses, however, the square represents man's base self, and that is your animal nature. This is a part of you which, simply speaking, is your lower self. The compasses represent your higher self, the 1/3 of the 180 degrees that represents spirit, your spiritual aspects, which are capable of higher thoughts, of a life beyond the material, physical, base nature. So he talks about, the change in the positioning of those instruments as we progress. The entered apprentice Mason has not yet learned how to rise above his base nature. Therefore, they're positioned a particular way. Fellowcraft is on his way to transcending his base nature. And as a master, a Mason is said to have learned the lessons necessary to transcend his base nature, check his ego at the door, and embrace his higher self. And I thought that was pretty cool. I
Yeah,
thought the way that he described that and worded that was as good as any explanation I've ever seen about that.
absolutely. And uh, it's exactly the way it is supposed to be. But you know what my heartburn is about that, right? You remember?
No, but I'm sure you're going to tell me.
Yeah, the Fellowcraft degree. I've talked about it before about the difference between our work and what is said at the altar when explaining the square and compasses and their position in our blue lodges, as opposed to what they say in, let's say, the Scottish Rite Blue Lodge degrees. You
Yeah,
know, they,
yeah.
they don't really explain that, like you said, that you're halfway, from the material to the spiritual, and I think that's important. That's an important thing to know.
Yeah, and you could say the same thing about the positioning of the apron as you progress.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. The spiritual and material are
Yeah.
separate, and then you're reaching towards the spiritual, and then the spiritual comes down and enters
Exactly.
into the material.
And I agree
That,
we should have a veil, over the deeper symbolic meanings, but this is not a veil. This is a canvas tarp, for God's.
so one of the
You
other things that I wanted to bring up along those lines is the thing about the Tyler's sword.
Oh, I was just going to do that. It's great. Go ahead. This is great. This
In
is
the opening of the lodge, we hear a description of the symbolic use of the Tyler's sword to prevent the approach of um, eavesdroppers and people that shouldn't be there, right?
right.
Uh, but his interpretation is that it is to prevent the approach of every unworthy thought. So that he says this tells us in no uncertain terms that the job of the Tyler takes place in the brain, and his job is to prevent the approach of unworthy uh, thoughts and feelings, and
Yeah.
that negativity entering into your thought process
Yeah.
is only harmful to yourself.
Isn't that a neat concept? And not only he writes it there, but he pretty much uh, tells us how it's part of their their opening ritual.
Yeah, in
In
Nevada. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
He talks about King Solomon states that there is strength in the lion of the tribe of Judah, and he's saying that the only way to raise oneself symbolically from a dead horizontal to a living perpendicular is to use the functions of the right side of the brain. This is why we camp to the east, the right brain hemisphere. Transcendence and an elevation above one's consciousness will not come about scientifically or mathematically through logic and reason, right? Which is our left brain functions. Elevation of consciousness requires intuition, higher emotions, and a holistic thought process, which are all right brain functions. So that kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the Lover's Tarot card and the symbolism there. But he utilizes numerology to try to prove some of his points. And I'm not a real big numerology guy or gematria guy, but I think those are rabbit holes that can drive you crazy if you go down them too far. But one of them was he's talking about now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. 430 years equals 4 plus 3 plus 0, which is 7. The number 7 symbolizes rising up through the 7 chakras, which is necessary for attainment of higher consciousness. The same path through the 7 chakras to the attainment of higher consciousness is contained within the officer's line of the Masonic Lodge. I he's 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 utilizing this to bring in some Eastern theological thought that I'm not so sure was present in the minds of the guys that crafted these degrees in the, arguably the 14, 15, 1600s. I mean, I suppose it's possible, but. And then he says Grandmaster Hiram Abiff represents mastership of the 7 chakras of the body. As in Masonic ritual, the Bible also describes Grandmaster Hiram Abiff as a cunning man. The word cunning is also used to describe a serpent, and the serpent is a symbol of rebirth and renewal. The cunning serpent also symbolizes the Kundalini, the serpent energy or hidden power within each one of us. I I don't know, man. I think that's kind of a leap of faith that I'm not necessarily prepared to take.
Yeah, I don't know
And
enough about it.
I
Talk
don't
about it.
disagree with Kundalini. I think there's a lot of legitimacy to it, but to try to correlate it with Masonry and then claim that the guys that developed the ritual had a working knowledge of it is a stretch that I'm not sure that I'm going to make. Brass is an alloy composed of copper and zinc. Zinc relates to the symbolic left brain and our physical lower nature. It is found in abundance in semen, which is representative of our lusts. Zinc is therefore symbolically attached to the pillar Jachin, being the symbolic left brain of our carnal desires. Copper is a shiny metal and as such represents the symbolic right brain or illumination. Moses had a copper serpent. Copper is attached symbolically to the pillar Boaz, being the symbolic right brain of our spiritual nature and holistic thinking. That Grandmaster Hiram Bibiff was a skilled craftsman working in brass tells us that he mastered the balance of the symbolic left brain and the symbolic right brain, which is zinc and copper, forming brass or perfect harmony. I don't know, man. That's the kind of statements. Those are the kind of statements that, for me, detract from the message of the book. I don't think that really proves anything. I think he's reaching there a little bit.
He talks about want versus desire in chapter 14. He talks about he goes into what constitutes a free man to be able to make the decision, to seek Masonic membership. It's of his own free will and accord, that we hear about all the time, and it's not at the he's talking about he has to be able he has to be free to make that decision. Okay, free mentally, and even physically to make that decision. And a lot of people talk about, it's someone who is not under, who is not a slave or bound by conscript or anything. And it goes back to your mind being free to make your own judgment, your own decision. And another one that we get kind of wrong from time to time.
Well, and then he talks about desire. I thought that was kind of an interesting portion of that chapter as well. Do you seriously declare upon your honor that unbiased by the improper solicitation of friends and uninfluenced by mercenary motives, you freely and voluntarily offer yourself as a candidate for the mysteries of Freemasonry? Yeah, I do. And that is why he has to be freeborn, free to make his own decisions, and transmit his burning desire for initiation into Freemasonry. It's not just of his own free will and accord, it's his desire to be initiated into the mysteries of Freemasonry. So desire plays a huge role in it.
Right. Which takes away coercion, threats, all of those things.
Yeah. So you could just as easily say, is it truly your desire to be initiated? So in chapter 15, he talks about the scripture reading from Amos. And he gets his variant from the New Century version of the Bible versus the King James version. And I highlighted it because the King James version is a little bit confusing and people may not even, for the most part, know what message it's trying to communicate. So in the New Century version, it says, "This is what he showed me. The Lord stood by a straight wall with a plumb line in his hand. The Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. Then the Lord said, see, I will put a plumb line among my people Israel to show how crooked they are, and I will not look the other way any longer." So when you compare that to what is actually written in the King James Version, thus he shewed me, and behold, the Lord stood upon a wall made by a plumb line with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said unto me, Amos, what seest thou? And I said, A plumb line. Then saith the Lord, Behold, I will set a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will not again pass by them anymore. And I remember reading that for the first time and going, what does that mean?
Mhm.
But if you read it in a newer version of the Bible, it's pretty plain. What he's saying is, look, I know that you're not acting the way that you're supposed to act, and I've been ignoring it, but now I'm not going to ignore it anymore. So, as a fellow craft mason, you know, maybe you were excused up to this point, but now that you've gotten some of the teachings under your belt and you know how you're supposed to act, it's not going to be ignored anymore. And I like the fact that he brings that out in his book.
Yep.
That's a great lesson. And unless you've been in a lodge where somebody has explained the scripture readings to you, or you've gone and researched it yourself, um, you may not have ever heard that before.
Yeah, and he also talks about this scripture reading and the explanation as having, having an association with one of the hermetic principles, the cause and effect
Yeah.
principle, which is right. I mean, right there. And I would have not picked that out, from the New Testament version, and I had, I had participated in those degrees many, many, many times and did not understand exactly what was going on. And this cleared it up a lot for me.
Yeah. And he says every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to the law. Chance is but a name for a law not recognized yet. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law, no matter the plane of causation. The next chapter, obviously, is one that I really liked.
Yeah, I know. I
And
knew you would.
uh, one of them, he says, Freemasonry is the only institution in the world that effectively carries an unbroken line of ancient mystery school teachings into the modern world.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. You got a lot of guys that are not going to agree with you on that. I mean, I hear them talk every day that there is no evidence that there is an unbroken chain of descendancy between the ancient mysteries and our Freemasonry.
I didn't say there was an unbroken line of descendancy, but we certainly employ all the same methodologies, the same teachings, and the same goals as the ancient mystery schools. And he's right. There is no other organization in the world that, well, I guess you could say Rosicrucianism, but even that is somewhat Masonic, that employs the same methodology. I mean, whether it's an unbroken line of an underground stream of knowledge that pokes its head out of the ground every couple of centuries, and the most recent incarnation is just called Freemasonry, or whether or not the developers of Masonic ritual utilized the teachings that were so effectively used for thousands of years in the ancient mystery schools is up for debate. I think obviously that the guys that formed our rituals pulled from that because they knew it worked. Um, but one way or the other, it really doesn't matter because we are the inheritors of the ancient mysteries, you know?
That's exactly right. It does not matter, and just because it went underground for a period of time and then stuck its head back out does not mean it's not part of that descendancy, that unbroken chain. I mean, it still can be just because we don't have solid, you know, literal proof of it.
Yeah, and you can look at any monitor in the United States probably and see some reference to the ancient mysteries. We use the same methodology that it's a graduated system of learning. You know, the cult of Mithras did the same thing. The Eleusinian mysteries did the same thing. The Egyptian mysteries did the same thing. Just all you got to do is research it a little bit, and you'll see so
Yeah.
many comparisons. Even the symbols that we use, the pomegranate, for instance, was used in the Eleusinian mysteries. I mean, that was all about Persephone and Demeter and her journey back from the underworld, but she ate the pomegranate seeds. So the pomegranate became a symbol in the ancient mystery school of Eleusis, and we use it. You know, maybe not for the same reason, but obviously we use the symbol.
Well, all the signs and all the symbols, everything is there. I mean, it's hard not to make that connection, as far as I'm concerned.
But it's the charge to the fellowcraft to avoid suspicion is two-pronged. He must avoid suspicion of others and avoid developing any suspicion about himself. Steer clear of any behavior that may cause others to become suspicious of your actions. I get that because you're in our ritual, you're told to conduct yourself in a manner that doesn't bring shame upon the institution or yourself. Um, but suspicion is a big word for them
Yeah.
over there, apparently.
Yeah, and I don't remember, anything that alluded to suspicion in the charge of the fellowcraft, at least in our work, and I didn't find it anywhere. But he also makes a point, which is a good point, that we shouldn't be suspicious of others for no particular reason, if we don't know the truth of what their situation is.
Well, and the same could be true for caution. I put a big question mark on there because he
Yeah.
says in the charge given to the newly entered apprentice, you are given a new name, caution, which is to teach you to be cautious over all your words and actions, especially on the subject of yourself when in the presence of your enemies. That is not familiar to me, but that
No.
goes back to um, keeping the secrets, right?
Right. And he's talking about being cautious. I mean, the premise of what he's saying is good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the lesson, but
Yeah.
he's also talking about your enemies are your enemies within your own self.
Yeah.
He makes a point that when talking about yourself, which could be a problem. So yeah, I mean, I don't disregard the lesson and I don't disagree with the lesson. It's just
Not
it's a
something that's familiar with us. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So let's
Very,
talk about the goat.
but you know what? I was blown away by the goat. This is something that I have absolutely detested ever since I became a Mason. I just tested brothers making a joke about it and trying to use it as a hate. And the problem is uh, the author of this book actually explains it in a way that's totally different from the way that we perceive it and the way that guys use it, those guys that still do use it. But the interesting part about it, the part that I found so interesting, was that the goat symbolizes all of our material desires, our lusts, and and all the bad stuff that we're still carrying around with us with our ego, and the symbolism of riding the goat, which when you ride something, I grew up on a ranch, so when you ride something, you have broken that animal spirit, and you are now
You have control.
exactly, you are now in control of that animal, and the symbolism of being in control of the goat symbolizes that you have overcome, or you're in the process or whatever of overcoming those lower impulses and all of that. And I liked that. I don't think that's something I'm going to promote or uh, or put into practice in any way, shape, or form. But due to our lack of ability or whatever to explain things to people properly, but it did make me feel better that there was an explanation for the goat story. I'd heard it from the Odd Fellows and everything had a goat that they made people ride and stuff like that. But this I'm glad that this was in the book. I'll be honest with you.
Well, in the immortal words of Dan Aykroyd, Jane, you ignorant slut. I don't agree with this at all. I think, and I have a chapter of it in my book. I think the whole idea of this goat is derived from anti-Masons. I think that was utilized to make us look foolish and somehow to make us look evil because in Wicca, in witchcraft of the 16th, 15th century, 16th century, um, that was a very prevalent image. um, of Asmodeus, arriving on a goat to their coven as a representative of the devil. And I think that that's where that originated. And I think the guys thought it was funny and started to incorporate it because they found it humorous. And then over time, the origin of it was lost, and guys just perpetuated it without knowing why. And I think if you ask anybody that still jokes about riding the goat where that came from, they wouldn't be able to tell you.
No, no.
And
They
I
would,
and I don't think that it originated with this idea of being in control of your lower self or your base natures. I,
no, it's
I
just
think
a
that's an
plausible
excuse.
explanation is all it is. But no, I don't think I agree with you on that. I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
23, the 47th problem of
Oh,
Euclid.
yes. Yes, yes, yes.
So his contention, and I think this is fascinating. I like this, is that we're not really referring to Euclid. We're referring to Spinoza, right?
Hmm. Yep.
We find our final clue, our X marks the spot moment in the culmination of Spinoza's writings, his 47th proposition. Proposition 47, the human mind has an adequate knowledge of the eternal and infinite essence of God. This is the answer we have searched for. The Masonic ritual writers, in using the 47th proposition of Euclid in the third degree lecture, were not pointing us in the direction of the mathematical Greek genius from 300 BC, but in the direction of Benedict Spinoza, the Euclid of the Age of Enlightenment. In his 47th proposition, Spinoza tells us what lies at the very heart of Freemasonry's teachings. The answers to everything are inside us. I think that's really cool.
It's very cool. It's very cool, and I'm sad that it doesn't cover that in our particular uh, lecture.
Yeah.
But
It says Freemasonry is one of many paths for the attainment of higher consciousness, which is the ultimate goal in life. This is why the candidate for Freemasonry must profess a belief in a higher power, a supreme being, or supreme consciousness. Otherwise, the teachings are useless.
he's already inside us.
Yep, the divine spark within, right?
Exactly.
And people are going to say, well, are you claiming to be God? No. Are you claiming that we're all gods? No. I think that what he says earlier in the book about threefold being, the mind, body. The mind is the soul, the physical body, and then the spirit. And the spirit is of God. And if you disagree with that, um, the spirit will return unto God who gave it. So, I mean, we all recognize that portion of the ritual, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the
Exactly.
scripture readings from Ecclesiastes.
Yep.
So his contention is you don't have a soul, you are a soul. You have a body. And within you is the emanation from God that animates you completely, and that's the divine spark within, that's the spirit. So
Exactly.
the idea is you have a body, a soul, and a spirit. I
Body,
like
soul.
yeah.
Exactly. And that very last subsection in that chapter says change your perception. And it says that which the Western world attributes to God, the Eastern world attributes to consciousness. Why? Because they are one and the same. God and consciousness are synonymous. Substitute the word God or Father with the word consciousness and see how your perception changes. God is creating and creative and creating, and all creation is God. Change it to consciousness. Consciousness is creative and creating, and all creation is of consciousness. God is all pervading. Consciousness is all pervading. God is, was, and always will be. Consciousness is, was, and always will be. God is the source of intelligence and wisdom. Consciousness generates intelligence and wisdom. Neutral order is a result of God. Natural laws are a result of consciousness. God resides within you. consciousness resides within you. Our Father who art in heaven, supreme consciousness who art in a permanent state of ever new bliss. I mean, it changes your perspective when you read it out like that.
Yeah, and people have tried to define consciousness for as long as people have been thinking.
Yeah.
And unsuccessfully to this point, but this is his attempt, and it's a pretty good one.
As open-minded as we are, as open-minded as we like to tell everyone we are, the truth is that the great majority of us are mostly closed-minded and opinionated. We refuse to accept the validity of anything that doesn't appeal to our sense of reason. And you get a sufficient number of these individuals together in the right positions of authority, and the result is chamber of reflection not allowed. Music and masonry not allowed, which we didn't go into, that's in this book. Watering down or elimination of penalties of the obligation, shortening and or elimination of the memory work, arbitrarily deciding that certain symbols do not have any place in masonry, like the skull and crossbones, and the list goes on and on and on. And all of that stuff I was thinking about as I was reading this book. I mean, it brings all of that stuff to the surface.
I'm really glad that you recommended this book. I enjoyed reading it. I didn't agree with everything in it. I certainly agreed with the premise, and I agreed with his contention that Freemasonry is a science and that it certainly has the impact that he claims that it has on us. The only thing I didn't necessarily agree with is some of the methodology he used to prove his case. I think it's self-evident, in my opinion, by observation. But I think it's worth having. I think it's worth reading. It ought to be on your bookshelf as a Mason. So we were talking earlier about a rating scale. Did we decide on one to 10 white balls?
I think that's the only one we had kind of was in agreement with.
Yeah, that's the only one we didn't laugh at or do away with immediately. So how many white balls on a scale of 1 to 10 do you give this book?
Well, I agree that this is something that every Mason should have in his bookshelf, and I also agree. I was confused. I was more confused than resistant to some of the things that you were resistant to. I kind of took the idea that I didn't know enough about it to really call foul on it, but I did enjoy it overall, and that's why I liked it so much. And I got a little bit more out of it the second time around. I think I'm going to give this book 8 white balls.
8 white balls. Okay. I'm definitely I'm recommending the book. I don't think I'm going to go as high as 8. I'm going to say 7.5.
Cool.
Although I don't know how you get a half ball.
I don't either. That's going to be hard. That's going to be a trip to the store.
But I'm going to use decimals in my rating scale. So
There you go. There you go. Well, overall, I thought it was a great book, and I'm glad we did it, and I'm glad you agreed to do it. I had my doubts there at the beginning whether it was going to be something you were going to really jump on, but we got a great book for next month already in the works, and
we're going to have a guest reviewer with us.
Exactly, a guest reviewer from some place called hold it Arkansas. Is that a place?
Yeah, and it's not Northeast Texas.
And Brother Minton is now going to be upset with me when he hears that.
So are the rest of the guys up here. You're going to start getting hate mail.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, from somebody besides me.
Right. Lose my address.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of the Masonic Shelf. We hope that you enjoyed it. We enjoyed reading it. We enjoyed bringing it to you. As always, keep reading, brethren.